Fine.
It is not a lawful order to command a paramedic to potentially paralyze a patient.
Okay.
Florida Statute 41.445 protects me from interference.
You think you're a lawyer now, huh? You think you can quote some rule book to me? I am the law out here.
The heat was a physical presence. It radiated in shimmering waves from the asphalt of Biscayne Boulevard, a suffocating blanket of humidity that made the air thick and heavy to breathe. For David Monroe, kneeling on the blistering pavement, it was just another element to be managed, a background noise in the symphony of chaos he inhabited. The call had come in at 4:52 p.m., a two-vehicle collision at the intersection of Biscayne and Flagler, right in the heart of downtown Miami's afternoon rush hour. The golden hour, paramedics called it, that critical first 60 minutes after a major trauma where every decision could be the difference between a full recovery and a lifetime of regret. Okay, Maria, I need you to keep looking straight up at that beautiful blue sky for me. Don't move your head, not even an inch, David said, his voice a calm, reassuring current beneath the cacophony of car horns and distant sirens. His hands, steady and practiced, worked with the precise economy of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He was 28, but in the world of emergency medicine, he moved with the quiet confidence of a seasoned veteran. His patient, Maria Flores, a woman in her late 40s with terror in her wide brown eyes, had been T-boned by a delivery truck that had blown a red light. Her sedan was a mangled wreck of steel and shattered glass, and she lay on a backboard just feet away, the metallic scent of leaked coolant mixing with the acrid smell of burnt rubber. "My legs! David, I can't feel my legs," she whispered, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "I know, Maria. That's why we're being so careful," David said, his focus absolute. He and his partner, Marcus Thorne, were a well-oiled machine. Marcus, a stout, unflappable man with 15 years on the job, was meticulously preparing the C-spine collar. Their movements were a silent language honed in the back of an ambulance, a dance of practiced efficiency. David held manual stabilization, his fingers firm but gentle on either side of her head and neck. His entire world narrowed to the few square inches of his patient. This was the most critical part of the procedure. Any sudden movement, any jarring shift before her spine was completely immobilized could sever the delicate nerves that were currently just bruised and compressed. It was the razor's edge between walking again and a wheelchair. The traffic was a monster, a snarled, unmoving beast of metal and frustration. Cars were backed up for miles in every direction, a testament to the city's circulatory system having a coronary. The incessant blare of horns was the sound of 1,000 people's patience fraying in the oppressive South Florida sun. David tuned it out. It was irrelevant. The angry drivers, the sweltering heat, the ticking clock. None of it mattered as much as the woman whose future was literally in his hands. "Collar is ready," Marcus announced, holding the rigid plastic device. "All right, on my count," David commanded. "We're going to log roller just enough to slip the board under completely. Keep that spine neutral. Ready? 1, 2, 3. They moved as one, a seamless, coordinated effort. As they gently rolled Maria, a new sound cut through the din, sharp and authoritarian. A series of short, aggressive blasts from a police car's siren, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on the asphalt. David didn't look up. His focus remained on Maria, on the delicate alignment of her vertebrae. "Almost there, Maria. You're doing great." "You! Paramedic!" The voice was sharp, laced with an impatience that felt jarringly out of place. It was a voice accustomed to instant obedience. "What the hell is the holdup here? You've had this entire intersection locked down for 20 minutes!" Marcus glanced up, his brow furrowing. David kept his eyes and hands on his patient. "Unit 34, we are stabilizing a patient with a suspected cervical spine injury," he called out, his voice firm but professional. "We will clear the scene as soon as she is fully immobilized for transport." "I don't want to hear it," the voice snapped back, closer now. "I've got the mayor on the radio screaming about this gridlock. You need to load her up and get the hell out of the way. Now!" David could feel the man's shadow fall over them, a sudden eclipse in the bright afternoon sun. He risked a quick glance upward. A white police officer, young, maybe early 30s, with a tightly squared jaw and reflective sunglasses that hid his eyes, stood over them. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid with indignation. The nameplate on his chest read T. Kincaid. His entire being radiated an aggressive energy, a palpable frustration that was aimed not at the accident, but at the consequences of it, the traffic, the inconvenience, and the paramedic who wasn't moving fast enough to fix it. This wasn't an officer arriving to assist the scene. This was an officer arriving to clear it. And David knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, that the golden hour had just become infinitely more complicated. Officer Trent Kincaid viewed the world through a lens of order and control. To him, this intersection wasn't a medical emergency scene. It was a clog in the city's artery, a problem to be solved. His priority was not the single woman on the ground, but the thousands of angry drivers trapped in the metal labyrinth he was tasked with untangling. He had spent the last hour fielding irate calls, his radio crackling with the fury of commuters and the mounting pressure from his superiors. In his mind, the paramedics were the problem. Their slow, methodical pace was, to his eyes, an infuriating lack of urgency. "I gave you an order, paramedic," Kincaid said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He stepped closer, planting his polished black boots just inches from the backboard, a territorial claim on the asphalt. "This isn't a suggestion. Get her on the gurney and into that bus, or I'll start writing obstruction tickets to every person on this crew." David didn't flinch. His hands remained steady on Maria's head. He had worked with cops his entire career. He understood the different pressures they were under, the different language they spoke. He de-escalated tense situations with stressed-out officers at crime scenes and chaotic accidents. But this was different. This wasn't stress. This was aggression. This wasn't about procedure. This was about dominance. "Officer, with all due respect, my patient has absent motor function below the waist and is complaining of paresthesia in her hands," David stated, deliberately using precise medical terminology. "Those are classic indicators of a severe cervical fracture. My primary duty, by law and by my medical oath, is to do no further harm. If we move her hastily, if we fail to properly immobilize her spine on this board, I could paralyze her for life." He was giving Kincaid a chance to understand, to see the situation from a medical perspective, to recognize a boundary he could not cross. He was appealing to their shared duty as public servants. Kincaid scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "I'm not a doctor, and I don't need a lecture. I see a fender bender and a woman who needs to get to a hospital. You're telling me you can't put her on a stretcher without taking all day? It sounds like you're just milking the clock, enjoying the show." The accusation, so deeply unprofessional and personally insulting, hung in the hot, humid air. Marcus, who had just secured the straps on the lower half of the backboard, froze. He looked at Kincaid, his face a mask of incredulous anger. "Are you serious? We're trying to save this woman's future, and you think we're milking the clock?" "You stay out of it," Kincaid snapped, pointing a finger at Marcus before turning his glare back to David. The reflective sunglasses acted as a mirror, showing David a distorted reflection of his own face, calm and determined. "I'm talking to him. He's the one in charge, right? He's the one holding everything up." A cold understanding washed over David. Kincaid wasn't listening. He wasn't capable of listening. He had already decided that David, a young black paramedic, was the source of his problem. David's calm, technical explanation wasn't being processed as professional expertise. It was being interpreted as defiance, as attitude. Kincaid's worldview had no room for a young black man to be the ultimate authority on this piece of pavement, even when a life was on the line. "Officer, I am the senior paramedic on this scene. My partner and I are following nationally recognized protocols for spinal cord injuries," David said, his tone remaining deliberately even. He refused to be baited. Maria could hear every word, and the last thing she needed was to feel the panic of the men trying to save her. "We are moving with all appropriate speed. Her life is the priority here, not the flow of traffic. Now, I need you to please step back and give us the space to do our job. He had drawn a line, not a challenge, but a clear professional boundary. He was asserting his jurisdiction, his responsibility. It was a line that any reasonable officer would respect, a moment for de-escalation where two sets of duties could find common ground. But Kincaid wasn't a reasonable officer. He saw the line not as a professional boundary, but as a personal affront. He saw David's refusal to capitulate as a direct challenge to his authority, to his uniform, to his very identity. He took another step forward, his hand dropping to rest casually on the butt of his holstered firearm, a gesture of casual intimidation that was impossible to misinterpret. The collision of duties was over. It had just become a battle of wills, and for Officer Kincaid, it was a battle he had no intention of losing. The air crackled with a tension that was thicker than the Miami heat. The symphony of angry horns seemed to fade into a dull roar, the world shrinking to the few feet of asphalt separating the paramedic and the police officer. David could feel Maria's body tense beneath his hands. She was their audience, a terrified, captive witness to a power struggle playing out over her broken body. "You don't get to give me orders," Kincaid said, his voice low and seething. He leaned down, bringing his face closer to David's, the mirrored sunglasses reflecting a warped image of a paramedic on his knees. "My uniform trumps your uniform. You work for the city. I am the city, and I'm telling you this scene is over. Pack it up." David's training, both from the academy and from years on the street, screamed at him. De-escalate, find common ground. But there was no common ground to be found. Kincaid had created a reality where his authority was absolute and David's medical knowledge was irrelevant. To comply would be a complete betrayal of his patient. It was a choice between his own safety and Maria Flores's future. It wasn't a choice at all. "Sir, the only thing that trumps my uniform right now is my patient's well-being," David replied, his voice still steady, a rock against the tide of Kincaid's anger. "We are in the middle of a delicate procedure, a life-altering procedure. I cannot and I will not stop." "Is that a refusal to obey a lawful order?" Kincaid's voice was slick with manufactured justification. He was building his case, laying the groundwork for whatever came next. "It's a refusal to commit malpractice," David countered, his eyes locked on Kincaid's. "It is not a lawful order to command a paramedic to potentially paralyze a patient. Florida Statute 401.445 protects emergency medical technicians from interference. What you are doing right now is illegal. Now, for the last time, please step back." The mention of a specific statute, the calm citation of the law, seemed to enrage Kincaid even more. It was a language he was supposed to own, and David was using it against him. It was another sign of defiance, another challenge he couldn't tolerate. "You think you're a lawyer now, huh?" Kincaid sneered. "You think you can quote some rule book to me? I am the law out here." He straightened up, his posture shifting from intimidation to action. The crowd of bystanders, initially just annoyed drivers, had started to take notice. Cell phones were beginning to emerge from pockets, their dark glass screens like a dozen unblinking eyes. The scene was changing from an inconvenience to an incident. Marcus saw the shift. "Kincaid, listen to him," he pleaded, his voice tight with urgency. "We're almost done. Just give us 60 more seconds. That's all we need." But Kincaid was no longer listening to anyone. His focus was entirely on David, the man who had dared to say no. In his mind, the logic was simple and unassailable. He had given an order. The order was not followed. Therefore, the person who disobeyed must be removed. The traffic jam, the patient, the medical realities, all of it had faded away. All that remained was the raw, ugly spark of conflict, the combustible mix of a fragile ego and absolute power. "I'm done asking," Kincaid announced, his voice booming with a false sense of finality. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, show me on scene with an uncooperative individual. I'm placing him under arrest." The words were so absurd, so completely divorced from the reality of the situation that for a moment, David could only stare. Arrest? For what? For doing his job, For protecting a patient. He could hear Maria let out a small, terrified sob. "Don't you dare," Marcus growled, starting to rise. But Kincaid was already moving. He took a decisive step forward, his intention clear. He wasn't just going to order David away, he was going to physically remove him. The spark had just found its fuel. The simmering conflict was about to erupt into a full-blown blaze, and Maria Flores was trapped at the very center of the inferno. The moment hung in the air, thick and heavy with inevitability. The declaration of arrest wasn't a tactic, it was a promise. David watched as Kincaid's hand moved from his radio, his fingers flexing. The world seemed to slow down, every detail sharpening with crystalline clarity. The beads of sweat on Marcus's forehead, the glint of sunlight off a bystander's phone, the shallow, frightened breaths of the woman whose life he was holding together. He made a decision. He would not be moved. "Officer, if you touch me or my patient, you will be committing assault," David said, his voice dangerously quiet, all traces of deference gone. It was a statement of fact, a final warning. He adjusted his grip on Maria's head, a silent reaffirmation of his duty. He was a shield, and he would not fail. Kincaid let out a short, humorless laugh. "Assault? You're the one obstructing a police officer in the performance of his duties. That's a felony. You've made your choice, paramedic." He lunged forward. It wasn't a shove or a push. It was a grab. Kincaid's hand, thick and powerful, clamped down on David's shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle through the fabric of his uniform. The force was jarring, a sudden, shocking violation of the sterile, protected space around the patient. Instinct and training took over. David didn't pull away, which would have compromised Maria's spine. He held his position, his body absorbing the force, his hands remaining rock steady on her head. "Get your hands off me," he commanded, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. From the corner of his eye, he saw Marcus move, stepping between Kincaid and the patient's body, creating a physical barrier. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus yelled, his voice echoing across the intersection. "You're going to kill her!" The sight of Marcus intervening, of two paramedics now actively resisting him, seemed to snap something in Kincaid. His frustration boiled over into pure rage. This was no longer about clearing traffic. This was about putting down a rebellion. "You're resisting arrest!" he roared, his face turning a deep, mottled red. He tightened his grip on David's shoulder, preparing to yank him away. The crowd of onlookers gasped. The scattered few who were filming now numbered in the dozens. They were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses. Their phones were digital eyes, capturing every second of the unfolding disaster. The sound of their collective shock was a rising murmur, a chorus of disbelief. "Leave him alone! He's helping her!" a woman shouted from her car window. The shout only served to fuel Kincaid's fury. He saw it as a challenge to his authority in front of an audience. He had to win. He had to dominate the scene. He ignored Marcus. He ignored the crowd. He ignored the terrified woman on the backboard. His entire world was focused on the paramedic who refused to bend to his will. With a final explosive exertion of strength, he used his grip on David's shoulder as leverage. "I told you," he grunted, the words tight with effort. "The scene is over." He pulled. It was a moment of pure, sickening violence. David, trying to maintain his grip on Maria, was wrenched backward. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder as Kincaid's fingers dug in. For a split second, his hands slipped from their position on Maria's head. It was only a fraction of an inch, a moment in time, but in the delicate world of spinal cord injuries, an inch was a universe. Maria's head shifted on the board, a small, unnatural movement that was met with a pained, guttural cry from her lips. It was the sound of irreparable damage. The sound broke through David's focus. The line in the pavement hadn't just been crossed, it had been obliterated. Kincaid hadn't just interfered with a medical procedure, he had become an active agent of harm, a uniformed vector of catastrophic injury. And in that horrifying moment, as he was being dragged away from the patient he had sworn to protect, David knew that this was no longer just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a crime. The world spun into a chaotic blur. The force of Kincaid's pull sent David stumbling backward, his balance lost. He landed hard on the hot asphalt, the impact jarring his teeth. The jump bag that had been open beside him tipped over, its carefully organized contents spilling across the grimy pavement. Syringes, rolls of gauze, medication vials, the tools of life-saving, scattered like children's toys in the dirt. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting a law enforcement officer," Kincaid shouted, his voice ringing with a triumphant finality. He was on David in an instant, his knee pressing hard into David's back, forcing his face against the sun-baked ground. The rough texture of the asphalt scraped against his cheek. The smell of oil and dust filled his nostrils. He twisted his head, his professional composure finally shattering. "My patient!" he cried out, his voice raw with a desperation that was almost primal. "Marcus, her spine! You have to stabilize her!" Kincaid wrenched David's arms behind his back with surprising force. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around his wrists. The sharp click, click, click as the ratchet tightened was the loudest sound David had ever heard. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, where the healer was treated like a criminal, where the protector was shackled. The bite of the metal into his skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. He was a paramedic, in uniform, on his knees, being cuffed over the body of his critically injured patient. The scene erupted. The crowd of witnesses surged forward from their cars, their murmurs of disbelief turning into a roar of outrage. "What are you doing? He was helping her!" "You idiot, you're going to kill that woman!" "We're filming this! We've got you on camera, you bastard!" Kincaid seemed momentarily stunned by the crowd's reaction, but his jaw hardened. He hauled David to his feet, his hand clamped firmly on David's upper arm. "Get back, all of you! Get back on the sidewalk now, or you're next!" he roared, his authority now a weapon turned against the very citizens he was sworn to protect. As he was being shoved toward the patrol car, David's eyes remained locked on the scene he'd been torn from. He saw Marcus, his face a canvas of fury and disbelief, desperately trying to re-establish manual C-spine stabilization on Maria. But Marcus was alone. A single person could not hold stabilization, manage the airway, and prepare for transport all at once. It was an impossible task. He saw Maria's face, pale and slack-jawed, her eyes wide with a terror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He knew with a sickening certainty that the delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven delay, was costing her precious nerve function, precious time, precious hope. Every second that ticked by while he was being marched to a police car was a second her chances of recovery diminished. The door of the patrol car was open, the heat from the black vinyl upholstery washing over him. Kincaid pushed him unceremoniously into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing him in a cage of plastic and metal. Through the reinforced glass and the metal grate, he watched the scene play out like a silent, horrifying movie. He saw Marcus on his radio, his mouth moving frantically, likely screaming for another unit, for a supervisor, for anyone who could fix this nightmare. He saw several of the bystanders, the ones who had been shouting, form a protective circle around Marcus and the patient, their bodies a defiant barrier against the officer who had betrayed his oath. Strangers, united in their shock, were now trying to do the job the police officer had abandoned. He was a paramedic, cuffed in the back of a police car, watching his own medical emergency unfold. And the person who had put him there, the man who was supposed to be his partner in the chaotic dance of public safety, had not just arrested him. He had abandoned his most fundamental duty. In that moment, sitting in the suffocating heat of the car, a cold, clear resolution formed in the pit of his stomach. This would not stand. Officer Trent Kincaid had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. He thought he had won a contest of wills, asserted his dominance. What he had actually done was ignite a fire that would consume him. The back of the patrol car was an oven, the vinyl seat stuck to David's uniform, and the handcuffs, cinched tight behind him, dug into his wrists with every slight movement. The air was thick with the sterile smell of plastic and the faint, acrid scent of old vomit. Through the metal partition, he watched Officer Kincaid. The man stood beside his driver's side door, speaking into the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. His back was to David, but his posture was rigid, defensive. He was crafting his narrative, turning David's life-saving actions into a story of obstruction, his professional urgency into a tale of non-compliance. David pressed his face against the hot window, his gaze fixed on the scene he'd been torn from. He saw Marcus, a lone warrior in a sea of chaos, managing to fit the sea collar on Maria. A bystander, a man in a business suit, was now holding the IV bag high, his face grim with determination. It was a testament to the human spirit, strangers working together to fight for a life. A stark contrast to the uniformed officer just yards away who had actively chosen to impede that fight. The wail of an approaching siren grew steadily louder, a welcome sound that nonetheless twisted a knot in David's gut. Help was coming, but it was help that should never have been needed, help that was arriving minutes too late. 4 minutes later, an eternity in trauma care, a fire rescue engine company screamed to a halt behind Marcus. 4 firefighters, their faces a mixture of confusion and urgency, jumped out and rushed to the scene with their own equipment. There was a frantic, hurried exchange of information. Marcus, still holding stabilization, pointed from the patient to David, locked in the back of the patrol car. One of the firefighters, a captain David recognized, whipped his head around, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw David's face pressed against the glass. The look was a mirror of what David felt, a deep, professional offense. One of us is in handcuffs while a patient is critical. It was a violation of a sacred trust, an act of interagency betrayal that was almost incomprehensible. The new crew worked with swift efficiency, their arrival finally bringing the manpower the scene had desperately needed from the start. They expertly took over, their movements a flurry of controlled, expert motion. David watched as they finally lifted Maria, her body limp, and secured her to the gurney. Was she conscious? Was she still breathing on her own? The not knowing was a physical torment. As they wheeled the stretcher toward the newly arrived ambulance, Marcus jogged over to the patrol car. His face was pale, streaked with sweat and fury. He couldn't open the door, but he leaned close to the window. "They're taking her to Ryder Trauma," he said, his voice strained. "She lost consciousness right after he pulled you off. Her blood pressure cratered. We're looking at neurogenic shock. David, he might have paralyzed her." The words hit David like a physical blow. Neurogenic shock, the catastrophic result of a severe spinal cord injury, where the body's ability to regulate itself goes haywire. The very thing he had been trying to prevent. The catastrophe that Kincaid's intervention had directly precipitated had happened. The delay wasn't theoretical anymore. It was measured in the death of nerve cells, in the potential destruction of a life. "Marcus, you need to call the battalion chief right now," David instructed, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "You need to document everything. The time Kincaid arrived, the time he first interfered, the time of the arrest, every single second." "Already did," Marcus said, his jaw tight. "He's on his way. The whole world is about to come down on this guy's head." The other ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing, its siren cutting a path through the grudgingly parting traffic. David watched it go until it was just a speck in the distance, carrying away the patient he had been forced to abandon. A profound sense of failure washed over him, even though he knew logically that the failure was not his own. Officer Kincaid finally finished his radio call and climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting David's in the reflection. There was no remorse in his gaze, no uncertainty, only a cold, self-satisfied hardness. He had enforced his will, and that was all that mattered. He started the engine and pulled away from the scene without a word. The city remained in gridlock, but now a life was in the balance as well. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the crackle of the police radio, a stream of mundane chatter about noise complaints and minor traffic stops that felt like it was from another universe. "That woman could be paralyzed," David said, the words breaking the silence. He needed to say it. He needed his accuser to acknowledge the consequence of his actions. Because of you. Because you couldn't wait 60 seconds. I hope your ego is worth a woman's future. Kincaid's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. You should have followed a lawful order, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. This is on you. You resisted. David leaned his head back against the hard plastic seat and closed his eyes. It was useless. Arguing with him was like arguing with a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. He had already convicted David in his mind to justify his own catastrophic misjudgment. But as they drove, David's training kicked in. Not his paramedic training, but the training every first responder receives about survival. Assess the situation. Identify the threat. Formulate a plan. The threat was no longer his patient's unstable spine. The threat was Officer Trent Kincaid and the department that stood behind him. The situation was no longer a medical crisis, but a legal one. And his plan, which was forming with crystalline clarity, was not just to survive this, but to make sure that no other first responder ever had to choose between their patient and their freedom again. The Miami-Dade County Pretrial Detention Center was a place David had been to dozens of times, but always through the ambulance bay. He'd dropped off intoxicated patients, people suffering mental health crises who needed to be medically cleared before being booked. He had always been on the other side of the divide, a respected professional in a clean uniform. Now he was being led through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind him, echoing the finality of his situation. Officer Kincaid gripped his arm, steering him through the corridors as if he were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered his uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and curiosity rippled through the room. A paramedic in cuffs was not a common sight. Kincaid pushed him toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun. Her nameplate read, Sergeant Rodriguez. Got one for booking, Kincaid announced, his voice unnecessarily loud. Obstruction of traffic and resisting arrest. Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from her paperwork, her gaze falling on David, then on Kincaid. She raised a skeptical eyebrow. Resisting who? Him? She looked back at David. I know you. You're Monroe from Station 4. You brought in that overdose victim from the bridge last week. What in God's name is going on, Kincaid? He refused to follow a lawful order at an MVA scene, Kincaid said, puffing out his chest slightly. Was interfering with my attempts to clear the road. What MVA? Rodriguez pressed, her tone sharp. She wasn't buying it. The cluster on Biscayne? I heard the chatter. Paramedics working a critical patient. Spinal injuries. What exactly was he obstructing? Her recovery? The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled. Kincaid's face flushed a deep red. He refused to clear the scene and became belligerent. Officer, I was immobilizing a patient with a suspected C-spine fracture, David interjected, his voice calm and measured. I informed your officer that moving her prematurely could cause permanent paralysis. Her life was the priority. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed, looking from David's resolute face to Kincaid's defensive one. The veteran sergeant had been on the job for 30 years. She could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. You pulled a medic away from a critical patient to clear traffic? She asked Kincaid, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. Is that what you're telling me? I was securing the scene, Kincaid insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. Rodriguez just shook her head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on her face. She turned to the booking officer. Process him, and be quick about it. Get his union rep on the phone. She shot a final, withering glare at Kincaid. My office. Now! The cold embrace of the system was beginning to show its first cracks of doubt. The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. David's fingerprints were taken, the black ink smearing on his skin, a stark contrast to the blue of his uniform. A mugshot was taken, the harsh flash of the camera capturing his exhausted but defiant expression. He was instructed to remove his personal belongings, his wallet, which contained his paramedic certifications and driver's license, his phone, his watch. Each item was placed in a clear plastic bag and catalogued with a bureaucratic indifference that felt like its own form of punishment. The young officer handling the booking seemed deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. He handled David's credentials with a reverence that bordered on an apology. Advanced cardiac life support, pediatric advanced life support, pre-hospital trauma life support. Man, you've got all the tickets, he muttered, reading from the certifications as he logged them. He looked up at David, his eyes full of a conflict he couldn't hide. "Sir, are the cuffs too tight? Did you sustain any injuries during the arrest?" "I'm fine," David replied, his voice flat. "But you should ask my patient that question, the one your colleague prevented me from treating." The officer flinched and quickly looked down, focusing on his paperwork. The message had been received. Through a nearby office door, David could hear the muffled but heated sounds of Sergeant Rodriguez's voice, rising and falling in a controlled fury as she dressed down Officer Kincaid. The words weren't clear, but the tone was. Kincaid wasn't being praised for his decisive action. He was being grilled. After the paperwork was complete, the officer led him down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan. "I'm sorry, sir. It'll just be until we can get things sorted out." The door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. David was alone. The cell was small, cold, and brutally simple. A concrete bench and a toilet. He sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through his uniform. For the first time since the call came in, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. He had dedicated his life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm. And for doing his job, for doing what was right, he had been locked in a cage. He put his head in his hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, and he was going to burn it to the ground. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. David measured its passage by the distant, muffled sounds of the station, phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for his injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation. He'd been in the cell for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes when he heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but a quicker, more energetic cadence. A woman in a sharply tailored charcoal suit stopped in front of his cell door. She was in her late 30s, with a sharp, intelligent face, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single, sweeping glance. She carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "David Monroe?" she asked, her voice calm and confident, a stark contrast to the despair of their surroundings. David stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is Jessica Morales. I'm an attorney with the firm of Blackwood, Stern and Associates. Your union president called our senior partner directly. I came as fast as I could." She offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over David. He wasn't alone anymore. The cavalry had arrived. The system he had dedicated his life to was now fighting for him. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Morales said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from her briefcase. "I've already had a spirited conversation with Sergeant Rodriguez. She's deeply unhappy with her officer's conduct, but the arrest report has been filed. Kincaid is doubling down. We need to build our case, starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Her eyes, sharp and focused, held his. "He picked a fight with the wrong paramedic today, Mr. Monroe. Now let's make him regret it." David recounted the entire event with the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history. He described the dispatch call, the mechanism of injury, Maria Flores's initial vitals, and the clear neurological deficits that had made spinal immobilization his top and only priority. He then detailed Officer Kincaid's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate and aggressive demands. He detailed his own repeated attempts to explain the medical urgency, Kincaid's refusal to listen, the physical assault, and the arrest. Jessica Morales listened intently, her pen flying across the page, her expression growing grimmer with every word. She would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he ever state what crime he suspected had been committed before he accused you of obstruction? No. His only concern was the traffic jam. He never once asked about the patient's condition. And you told him that moving her could cause paralysis? Multiple times. I was explicit. I used the word paralyze. And you offered to comply with his requests once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved? I told him we would clear as soon as she was safely immobilized. That's standard procedure. Morales nodded, a grim satisfaction on her face. That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the primary duty of care was fulfilled. His refusal to accept that is key. Maya, she corrected herself quickly, a slip from a previous case. David, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call, it was illegal. State law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you. She closed her notepad. They'll release you within the hour. The charges are baseless. They won't even make it to a prosecutor's desk. This is a classic case of what we call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. Kincaid arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law. What about my patient? David asked, the question that had been tormenting him for hours. Maria Flores. Do you know anything? Jessica's expression softened, the sharp legal mind replaced by a look of genuine empathy. Your partner Marcus gave me an update. It's not good. She took a breath. She was transported to Ryder Trauma Center. As you suspected, she went into neurogenic shock in the ambulance. They had to intubate her. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The initial MRI is devastating. She has an unstable fracture at the C5 and C6 vertebrae. The neurologist on her case reviewed the timeline from your partner. He believes the fracture was likely non-displaced on initial impact, but that the interruption during your immobilization procedure caused a secondary injury. The jarring movement when you were pulled away from her. David felt the air leave his lungs. It was his worst fear realized. The delay, David, Jessica continued, her voice low but firm. The time it took for the second crew to arrive and get her to the hospital. The neurologist is on record stating that those minutes were critical. He's calling the damage catastrophic. She's currently in surgery to fuse her spine, but the prognosis is grim. They're talking about permanent quadriplegia. Quadriplegia. The word was a death sentence for the life Maria Flores had known. A 50-something office manager, a mother, a wife. All of it erased in a few minutes of ego-driven rage on the side of a highway. The cost of Kincaid's impatience wasn't just a traffic jam. It was a woman's ability to walk, to feed herself, to ever hold her family again. The cost was a lifetime. This changes everything, Jessica said, her voice now cold as steel. This goes from being a clear-cut unlawful arrest and civil rights violation to a potential wrongful injury suit with damages in the tens of millions. The city knows that. They're already in damage control mode. True to her word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Rodriguez was standing there, her expression stern. You're being released on your own recognizance, Monroe. The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to stick. She handed David the plastic bag with his belongings. For what it's worth, she said, her voice low, I'm sorry this happened. He was out of line. David just nodded, taking his property. The apology was a small concession, but it was something. As he walked out of the station with Jessica Morales at his side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, he felt like he was surfacing after being held underwater. He was free, but he wasn't whole. A part of him was still back on that highway, fighting for a life that had been needlessly shattered. And another part of him was now steeling itself for the bigger fight to come. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Marcus was waiting for him in the parking lot, leaning against the side of their ambulance which he'd retrieved from the impound lot. His uniform was rumpled, and his face was etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He straightened up as soon as he saw David, rushing forward to pull him into a firm, brotherly hug. "Man, I'm so sorry. I should have done more," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did everything you could," David said, pulling back. "You stayed with her. That's all that mattered. What's the latest?" Marcus's face clouded over. "She's out of surgery. It's bad, David. Really bad. They stabilized the fracture, but the damage to the cord is severe. The neurosurgeon came out to talk to her husband. He said the outcome would have been markedly different if she had arrived 15 minutes earlier." The words landed like stones in David's stomach. 15 minutes. The time Kincaid had stolen from them while he postured and demanded and finally arrested him. Those were the minutes Maria Flores's life was draining away. The image of Kincaid's smug, self-satisfied face flashed in his mind, and his simmering anger ignited into a white-hot flame. "Her family?" David asked, his voice tight. "Her husband and 2 adult sons are there. They're devastated. They know what happened. The witnesses on scene told them everything." Jessica Morales, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. Her expression was grim. "This confirms our path forward. The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Kincaid's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, David. We're talking about a woman who has been catastrophically injured because a police officer couldn't handle being told no." What none of them knew yet was that the court of public opinion was already in session. It had started with a single video, uploaded to Twitter by a graphic designer who had been stuck 3 cars back from the incident. The 30-second clip was shaky but clear. It showed David kneeling over his patient and Officer Kincaid looming over him, shouting. It captured the moment Kincaid grabbed David's shoulder. The user had tagged the local news stations and the Miami Police Department with a simple caption. "Is this protect and serve? At Miami PD, officer attacks paramedic trying to save a woman's life after a car crash. Hashtag Biscayne Boulevard." It was a spark thrown into a digital tinderbox. Within an hour, it had 1,000 retweets, then 10,000, then 100,000. Other videos began to surface, each showing the incident from a different angle. A clearer video from a tour bus window showed the entire arrest, the spill of medical equipment, the raw disbelief on the faces of the other first responders. The hashtag Justice for David Monroe started trending. By the time David was released, the story was the lead item on every local news broadcast. By nightfall, it was on the national news. The image of David in his blue uniform being forced into the back of a patrol car while his patient lay on the ground was broadcast across the country. It was a perfect, horrifying encapsulation of a narrative many already believed. A story of police overreach, of ego overriding duty, of a system failing the people it was meant to protect. David's phone, which he'd gotten back with his other belongings, began to light up with calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues from across the state, all expressing their shock and support. The Firefighters and Paramedics Union issued a blistering statement standing firmly behind David, calling his actions heroic and Kincaid's a criminal assault on a first responder. The police department, in contrast, issued a terse defensive statement, saying the incident was under internal investigation and that Officer Kincaid had been placed on administrative desk duty pending the outcome. The battle lines had been drawn. David, with the backing of his union and Jessica Morales' powerhouse law firm, stood on one side. On the other stood Officer Kincaid and a city bureaucracy that would now go to extraordinary lengths to protect itself and its employee from the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war, and the first shots had just been fired on the battlefield of public opinion. The viral outrage had given them a powerful weapon, but it had also guaranteed that the city's defense would be just as ferocious. They weren't just fighting a lawsuit anymore, they were fighting a symbol. In the world of high-stakes litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of resolve. 2 weeks after the incident, with the story still simmering on national news outlets and David on paid leave from the job he loved, Jessica Morales received the call she had been expecting. It was from the city attorney's office. "They want to talk settlement," she told David over the phone. Her voice was flat, betraying no emotion. "They're trying to gauge how serious we are. They're scared of the publicity, and they want this to go away quickly and quietly." "What are they offering?" David asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He was living in a surreal bubble. His days were spent in meetings with lawyers instead of responding to 911 calls. He couldn't go to the grocery store without being recognized, with strangers stopping him to shake his hand and thank him for standing up. The attention was uncomfortable, but it strengthened his resolve. Jessica let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $50,000 for your trouble. They called it a nuisance value settlement." David was silent for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of the offer. $50,000. It wasn't a settlement, it was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head, a pittance meant to make the problem go away before it got too expensive or embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of rights and a near-fatal dereliction of duty, but as a public relations inconvenience to be managed. It was a number that placed zero value on what had been done to him, and even less on what had been done to Maria Flores. "Tell them no," David said, his voice laced with ice. "Tell them I'll see them in court." "That's what I thought you'd say," Jessica replied, a note of pride in her voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure and the media attention would make you fold." She paused. "They misjudged you, David. They've made a critical error." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had mistaken David's quiet professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that his fight was no longer just about his own vindication. It had become about Maria. Maria had survived the surgery, but just barely. She had spent 10 days in the ICU, breathing through a ventilator. When she was finally weaned off, the doctors delivered the devastating news. The spinal cord injury was incomplete but severe. She had some limited, agonizingly weak movement in her arms, but she was paralyzed from the chest down. She would never walk again. She would require round-the-clock care for the rest of her life. She was 48 years old, and her life had been permanently, catastrophically altered because of a 7-minute delay on the side of a highway. Her family had retained their own lawyer and were preparing a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city and Officer Kincaid. The two cases, while legally distinct, were inextricably linked. Every victory for David would be a victory for Maria. The city's refusal to take his lawsuit seriously had the opposite effect they intended. Instead of silencing him, it galvanized him. And when news of the nuisance value offer leaked to the press, a strategic leak from Jessica's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by David's fire station to help with any uncovered expenses was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. Paramedics from as far away as California and New York sent messages of solidarity. He had become an unwilling symbol for every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. The pressure on the city mounted. The police chief held a disastrous press conference where he was hammered with questions about Officer Kincaid's disciplinary record. It was revealed that Kincaid, in his short 6-year career, had accumulated over a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority, none of which had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. They had tried to put out a bonfire with a squirt gun, and instead, they had just poured gasoline all over it. With settlement talks having crashed and burned, the case moved into the discovery phase. It was a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears, a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents and data. For months, Jessica Morales' office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city. Training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and Officer Kincaid's complete, unredacted personnel file. "It's exactly what we expected," Jessica told David during one of their strategy sessions, gesturing to a mountain of binders on her conference table. "A clear pattern of escalating aggression, a dozen complaints all describing the same behavior, impatience, verbal abuse, unnecessary escalation, and every single one of them was dismissed with a note from his supervisor saying he was counseled. They didn't discipline him, they enabled him. But all of it was secondary to the single digital file they had been fighting for, the one the city's attorneys had tried to block at every turn. It finally arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier. The complete, unedited footage from Officer Trent Kincaid's body camera. Jessica had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. David sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Marcus was there too, for support and to corroborate the sequence of events. "Are you ready for this?" Jessica asked him gently. David took a deep breath and nodded. "Play it." The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the ground as Kincaid got out of his patrol car. The audio was crystal clear. The roar of the highway, the crackle of his radio, the angry shouts of other drivers. Then he began walking toward the scene. The camera's perspective was his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation to come. He approached the wrecked car, his voice already sharp. "What's going on here? Everybody back up!" Then the camera centered on him. A version of David kneeling on the ground, his back to the camera, completely engrossed in his patient. The footage was visceral, immediate. It captured the gray, sweaty pallor of Maria Flores's skin, the shallow, desperate gasps for air she was taking. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that she was in extreme distress. The audio was even more damning than David remembered. "You, paramedic, what the hell is the holdup here?" Kincaid's voice commanded, cold and devoid of any empathy. "Unit 34, we are stabilizing a patient with a suspected cervical spine injury," his own voice replied, calm and focused. "We will clear the scene as soon as she is fully immobilized for transport." The camera showed him, not even looking up, his hands moving with purpose. The footage perfectly corroborated his story. His attention was, and remained, on saving a life. "I don't want to hear it. Load her up and get the hell out of the way. Now!" Watching it now, from Kincaid's perspective, was chilling. The camera showed no interest in the patient. It remained fixed on David, the perceived source of defiance. It recorded David's clear, concise explanations of the medical emergency and his lawful duty. It recorded his offer to have his credentials verified by other means. It recorded the moment he dismissed Kincaid to coordinate with Marcus. Then came the escalation. The camera lurched as Kincaid stepped forward to block him. His voice, captured by the microphone inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You don't get to give me orders." The most crucial moment was the arrest itself. The video showed Kincaid's hand reaching out, grabbing David's shoulder. It showed him yanking David away from the patient. The camera swung wildly, capturing the medical kit spilling across the ground. Then the view became a chaotic jumble of David's back and the sky as Kincaid spun him around and forced his arms behind him. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect clarity by the microphone. The video continued for another 20 minutes. It showed the angry shouts of the construction workers. It showed Marcus, his face a mask of desperation, trying to manage the scene alone. It showed the arrival of the fire engine, and it showed the long, silent walk back to the patrol car where David was placed in the back like a piece of cargo. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Marcus was shaking his head, his face pale. David felt strangely numb, vindicated but also sickened. It was all there, every lie in Kincaid's report, every self-serving statement the city had made was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Jessica Morales sat back in her chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across her face. She looked at David. "In 15 years of practicing law," she said, her voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest. It recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life." She stood up and began to pace the room, energized. "This changes everything. The city's lawyers will see this footage and they will know their case is unwinnable. They wanted to silence this story with a check. Instead, they've just handed us the gun that will let us blow their entire defense to pieces." A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Trent Kincaid walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. His uniform was crisp, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had on the highway. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative paramedic. He believed his badge and his version of the story would protect him. He was wrong. For the first hour, the city's attorney led Kincaid through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area, and paramedic Monroe's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with his lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job. Then it was Jessica Morales' turn. She began calmly, her questions simple and direct. "Officer Kincaid, you've been with the Miami Police Department for 6 years, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes?" "Yes, ma'am. We receive extensive training." "And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency?" Kincaid shifted in his seat. "My priority is to secure the scene for the safety of all personnel." "That wasn't my question, officer," Jessica said, her voice still mild. "Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like clearing a lane of traffic?" The city's attorney objected, but Jessica just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Mrs. Flores, was not in serious medical distress?" "I am not a medical professional," Kincaid said stiffly. "I could not make that assessment." "Exactly," Jessica pounced, her tone sharpening. "You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing care. Is that correct?" "I ordered him to step back so I could secure the scene." Jessica nodded slowly, then turned to her paralegal. "Please play the first video exhibit, body camera footage of Officer Kincaid, timestamp 16:54:12. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the highway, and the video began. Jessica had Kincaid watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his initial aggressive demands. "Officer," Jessica said, pausing the video just after Kincaid had yelled, "Load her up and get the hell out of the way, now!" At this point, you had been on scene for less than 30 seconds. You had not spoken to any witnesses. You had not assessed any potential threats. Yet you decided the most important action was to stop the paramedic from treating his patient. Why? I was establishing control of the scene, Kincaid repeated, his jaw tight. Control over what exactly? A man on his knees trying to save a woman's life? Jessica let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where David calmly explained the patient's condition. She paused it again. Officer, on this video, we can hear Paramedic Monroe, a decorated first responder, telling you the patient has absent motor function and classic signs of a cervical fracture. Did you know what that meant? Kincaid hesitated. I have basic first aid training. So you understood it was a life-threatening spinal injury? I understood it was a medical situation. And yet your response was not to ask how you could help. It was not to clear the area for him. It was to demand he hurry up. Is that right? For the next 4 hours, Jessica dismantled Kincaid's story piece by piece, using the officer's own camera footage as the wrecking ball. She forced him to watch himself grab David's shoulder. Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer. Kincaid stared at the screen, his face pale. I am effecting an arrest. You are physically assaulting a licensed paramedic and preventing him from rendering aid, Jessica corrected him. Did you see the medical kit spill onto the ground? Did you see the patient's head move when you pulled Mr. Monroe away? Did you hear her cry out in pain? By the end of the deposition, Trent Kincaid was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Jessica had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with her relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The day after the disastrous deposition, Jessica Morales' phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city of Miami. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of defeat.
They want to settle,
Jessica told David later that day in her office. They know the deposition was a train wreck. They know what that body camera footage will do to a jury. They're no longer talking about nuisance value. She slid a piece of paper across the polished mahogany desk. On it was a number. $5 million. David stared at the figure. $5 million. It was an incredible amount of money, a life-changing sum. It was a clear admission of guilt, a signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on. His annual salary was around $65,000. This was more than he could earn in a lifetime of running calls. It was enough to pay off his mortgage, set up a college fund for his future kids, and live without financial worry for the rest of his life. It was everything the city had said his ordeal wasn't worth, and then some. Part of him, the tired part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to say yes. He wanted it to be over. He wanted to stop the endless meetings, the media attention, the gnawing anxiety of the impending trial. He wanted to go back to his life, to his ambulance, to the simple, profound work of saving people. What do you think? He asked Jessica, his voice quiet. Jessica leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. From a purely financial perspective, it's a very strong offer. We could probably push them a bit higher, but this is in the ballpark of a major victory without the risk and stress of a trial. If you take this, you walk away with financial security, and we can get them to expunge the arrest record as part of the deal. No one would blame you for taking it. She paused, her gaze steady. But you didn't come to me for a purely financial perspective. You came to me for justice. Justice. The word hung in the air between them. Was this justice? A check and a quiet end to the affair? Officer Kincaid would likely be fired, but the system that created him, the policies that enabled him, would remain unchanged. The next Officer Kincaid in another city on another highway could do the very same thing to another paramedic. The money would fix his problems, but it wouldn't fix the problem. He thought about Maria Flores, who was beginning a long, painful rehabilitation, her life forever diminished. He thought about the messages of support he'd received from EMTs and paramedics across the country, stories of their own run-ins with police, of being bullied, threatened, and treated like subordinates instead of partners. He thought of the fear they all felt, the worry that doing their job correctly could cost them their own freedom. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The viral videos, the media attention, the deposition, it had all turned his case into something bigger. It had become a test case, a potential landmark for the rights of all first responders. "This offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it?" David asked. Jessica nodded. "Of course. A very strict one. They want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. They want to make sure that body camera footage is never shown in a public court, that Kincaid's deposition transcript is never released. That's the real prize for them." That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy his story, to bury the truth he had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay him to pretend this never happened. "No," David said, the single word firm and clear. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "No deal." A slow smile spread across Jessica Morales' face. It was the answer she had been hoping for. "I thought you might say that." "This isn't about the money, Jessica," David continued, leaning forward, his eyes flashing with a fire she hadn't seen before. "It was never about the money. This is about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that body camera footage shown in court. I want Kincaid to have to answer for what he did in front of a jury. And I want a verdict that sends a message not just to the city of Miami, but to every police department in this country. You do not interfere with medical personnel who are saving a life, period." His stand was a declaration. He was turning down a fortune for a principle. He was choosing the uncertainty and agony of a public trial over the comfort of a private settlement. It was a choice that would require immense courage. But for David, it was the only choice he could live with. He had fought for his patient on the side of the road, and now he would fight for every patient and every paramedic in a court of law. The city thought they could buy his silence. They were about to learn that his integrity was not for sale. The energy in the federal courtroom was electric on the fourth day of the trial. This was the day the jury would see what happened for themselves. The preceding days had been filled with powerful testimony. The jury had heard from Marcus, who angrily recounted watching his partner be arrested while their patient crashed. They heard from the ER doctor at Ryder Trauma Center, who explained in precise clinical detail how the delay in transport and the jarring movement during the arrest had directly contributed to the severity of the damage to Maria Flores's spinal cord. Most powerfully, they had heard from Maria's husband, who described, through tears, how his vibrant, active wife now needed help with every basic task of living. Now, Ben Carter, Jessica's senior partner and the lead trial counsel, called his final witness, David Monroe. David walked to the stand with a quiet confidence. He looked professional and composed in a simple dark suit. For an hour, Carter led him through his story, his training, and the events on Biscayne Boulevard. His testimony was clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. He spoke not as a victim, but as a professional, explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. He described the medical situation in detail, explaining to the jury why every second was critical. Then Carter walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of Officer Trent Kincaid." The lights in the courtroom were dimmed slightly. The room was silent as the video began to play. For the next 10 minutes, the jury was transported to the side of that highway. They saw the scene not from a distance, but through the eyes of the man who caused the crisis. They saw David's focused professionalism. They saw Maria Flores's gray, dying face. They heard Kincaid's aggressive demands and David's calm, firm refusals. They heard him literally pleading for his patient's life. And then they saw it. They saw Kincaid, from his own point of view, lunge forward and grab David. They saw him yank David away from his patient. They saw him spin David around and force his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors flinched. One woman, a registered nurse, put her hand over her mouth in shock. A man in the front row, a retired Marine, shook his head slowly in disgust. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore, they were witnessing an assault. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. The footage had transformed the case. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. The city's attorney knew she was in deep trouble. Her cross-examination of David was tentative. She tried to portray him as insubordinate, but the video had already refuted that. Mr. Monroe, you'd agree that when a police officer gives you an order, you should follow it? I agree that I should follow a lawful order, David corrected her gently. An order that forces me to abandon a critically injured patient in violation of my medical oath and state law is not a lawful order. She had no effective rebuttal. David's testimony, backed by the unblinking eye of the camera, was a fortress. After David stepped down, the defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Trent Kincaid. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. His lawyer led him through his testimony, but it was a hollow exercise. Everyone in the room had already seen the truth. His claims of a chaotic scene and a belligerent paramedic sounded absurd after watching the video. Then it was Carter's turn for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand, not with anger, but with a quiet, surgical precision. Officer Kincaid, he began, we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a paramedic while he was actively treating a woman with a catastrophic spinal injury. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, is there anything you would have done differently? It was a lifeline, a chance for Kincaid to show some remorse, some humanity. He could have said, in hindsight, I should have waited. He could have said, I misjudged the situation. He could have said anything to show the jury he understood the gravity of his mistake. But he didn't. His pride, the same pride that had caused this disaster, would not let him. No, Kincaid said, his voice defiant. I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene. Carter let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. No further questions, Your Honor. It was a mic drop moment. In that single defiant answer, Trent Kincaid had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that, given the chance, he would do it all again. He confirmed for them that he was not an officer who had made a terrible mistake under pressure, but a man who fundamentally believed his authority was more important than another person's life. The jurors' faces were like stone. They had seen the video and now they had seen the man, and in their eyes there was no doubt left at all. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The city's attorney did her best with a losing hand, arguing that Officer Kincaid's actions, while perhaps not ideal, were made in a high-stress environment. She pleaded with the jury not to judge him with the benefit of hindsight. Police officers have to make split-second decisions, she argued. It may not have been the perfect decision, but it was not a violation of the Constitution. Then Ben Carter rose to give his closing statement. He didn't shout. He spoke with a quiet, righteous anger that was far more powerful. He stood directly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each of them. For 4 days we have talked about laws and procedures, he began. But this case is about a choice. Officer Trent Kincaid arrived at a scene where a man was on his knees fighting to keep a woman from a lifetime in a wheelchair. And he had a choice. He could have chosen to help. He could have chosen to protect the scene, to direct traffic, to give that paramedic the space he needed to do his sacred work. He could have chosen to be a partner. Carter walked over to the evidence table and picked up a pair of handcuffs, holding them up for the jury to see. Instead, he chose this. He chose his ego. He chose his authority. He looked at a life hanging in the balance and decided that clearing traffic was more important. He chose to turn a medical rescue into a crime scene of his own making. He let the silence hang in the air. David Monroe also had a choice. He could have complied. It would have been the easy thing to do. But he chose his oath. He chose his patient. He chose to honor his duty, even when it meant being humiliated, arrested, and caged like an animal. His decision cost him his freedom. Officer Kincaid's decision cost Maria Flores her future. Carter turned back to the jury, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The city wants you to excuse his action, but he sat on that stand yesterday and told you he wouldn't change a thing. He is asking you to ratify his behavior. He is asking you to tell every police officer in this country that it is acceptable to pull a first responder off a critically injured patient. Your verdict today will do more than decide this case. It will send a message about what we value as a society. Do we value blind obedience over professional duty? Do we value ego over empathy? Do we value a badge over a human life? Send a message that the answer is no. Send a message that will protect every first responder who has to make that same hard choice David Monroe had to make. Send a message that justice in this courtroom is not for sale. The jury filed out. The wait began. An hour passed, then 2. Just after 3 p.m., the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The jurors filed back into the box, their faces unreadable. The foreman handed a slip of paper to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. The judge read it, his expression unchanging, and handed it back to the clerk to be read aloud. In the matter of Monroe versus Kincaid and the city of Miami, the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room. On the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, David Monroe. A gasp went through the courtroom. On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, David Monroe. David squeezed his eyes shut as tears began to stream down his face. Jessica put a comforting hand on his shoulder. We will now read the damages, the clerk continued. For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $5 million. The number was staggering, but the foreman wasn't finished. And for punitive damages to be levied against Officer Trent Kincaid and the city of Miami for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $20 million. The courtroom erupted in stunned murmurs. $25 million. It was a thunderous verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish and to send a message. It was a statement. The jury hadn't just sided with David, they had adopted his outrage. They had sent the message Carter had asked for, a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. David sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming sense of vindication. The jury had seen him, they had heard him, and they had believed him. Justice had been done. The verdict was an earthquake. The $25 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city. The first domino to fall was Officer Trent Kincaid. Less than a week later, he was fired. His career in law enforcement was over. Facing immense public pressure and the looming, even larger lawsuit from Maria Flores's family, which they quickly settled for a massive, undisclosed sum, the city council approved a sweeping overhaul of police training. The new policy, known informally as the Monroe Mandate, was explicit. At a medical emergency, the senior paramedic is in command of patient care. The body camera footage, once a piece of evidence, was now a powerful educational tool, used to teach new recruits on both sides of the divide about the critical importance of communication and respect. David eventually returned to work at Station 4. The money afforded him financial freedom, but he couldn't imagine doing anything else. It was who he was. Things were different now. Officers at scenes treated him and all paramedics with a new level of deference. He had fought the war so they could do their jobs in peace. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, what drove Officer Trent Kincaid? It wasn't simple malice. It was something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, where control was paramount. In his mind, David's calm, professional refusal was not a difference of opinion, but a direct threat to his identity as an officer. His badge was not a tool for service. It was armor for a fragile ego. If he had been able to pause, to listen, to see the injured woman on the ground as a person instead of a problem, the entire tragedy could have been averted. And what of David? If he had been less confident, less principled, would he have backed down? If he hadn't possessed that core of steel, perhaps he would have made the easy choice to move his patient, gambling with a stranger's future to avoid a confrontation. The victory was born not from the injustice of a single moment, but from a lifetime of character that had unknowingly armed him for that specific fight. This story is a testament to the fact that one person's unwavering commitment to their duty can expose and correct a systemic flaw. It reminds us that true courage isn't about being confrontational. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is a firm, quiet, and unshakable no. What do you think is the most important lesson from David's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.